Joining us now is the former FCC chair, Ajit Pai. He's now a partner at Searchlight Capital, a private equity firm. Nice to have you here.
Good to be with you.
I mean, we were dealing with the ban of TikTok towards the end of your first time, well, when you were chair and the end of the last Trump administration. Where do you stand on it this time? Do you think it's appropriate?
Well, I think the Supreme Court is weighing some of the same national security considerations and free speech considerations that animated Congress in the first place to pass the law. And that law, as you know, was itself predicated on President Trump's August 2020 executive order in which he said that this was a national emergency, that this issue deserved attention. And so I think what you saw in the Supreme Court was a really serious consideration of the national security considerations involved in ByteDance, a Chinese-owned corporation, potentially controlling some of the data of U.S. users of TikTok. So.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, they were weighing the free speech implications of it. Many who listened to the arguments believe they were coming down more in favor of the national security considerations. We'll have to wait and see. Meanwhile, your former boss, President-elect Trump, is now not in favor of the ban. And I'm sort of curious as to whether you have a playbook at all on how it'll play out, given obviously the legislation has already been passed.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does. Obviously, they're weighing those issues that I discussed. But in the oral argument, if you listened, you also opened the door some procedural complexities. For example, could the Supreme Court issue an administrative stay to allow the next administration to take some action to facilitate a divestiture that it thought was qualified? Could the next administration simply decide not to enforce the law? These are the types of things that the Supreme Court opened the door to. And interestingly, the Solicitor General said that she was not necessarily opposed to administrative stay or to the next administration having a chance to issue its own extension of the divestiture deadline. So we'll see what happens. The next week is going to be very fraught, both in the judicial branch and in the next executive branch.
Does the president have a mechanism to intervene otherwise?
Well, so the president-elect did submit an amicus brief in this particular case, weighing in on neither particular side. But once he takes office, he might, as the Supreme Court seemed to hint, have the opportunity to extend the deadline for divestiture. And that's one of the things that it wasn't really fleshed out in the oral argument, but there could be a possibility.
What about these groups that want to buy TikTok here, American investors? Like the latest is Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank.
Yeah.
I mean, does he's been at Mar-a-Lago. Does that help the chances, or is that ultimately just in the Chinese decision-makers' hands?
Ultimately, it's in the Chinese decision-makers' hands. China has been very clear that they would not approve ByteDance divesting to any buyer, wonderful or not. And so I think it's going to be a question of whether or not the Chinese government allows there to be a divestiture. But to the extent that there are discussions that are material, the law does give the president, either the current president or the president-elect, the ability to extend by 90 days the divestiture deadline if indeed those discussions are going to be likely to be fruitful. So we'll see if a buyer emerges in the next week who's credible enough.
Given all the complexities and uncertainties, how do you think about the rivals of TikTok and how they're planning for a range of outcomes?
It's interesting. What you saw in other places where TikTok has been banned or limited, for example, in India, where TikTok was outright banned, is that there's been a massive shift to other platforms, YouTube and Instagram. And so I would imagine there might be a similar dynamic here if indeed TikTok is no longer available on U.S. communications platforms. But I think by and large, the U.S.-based social media companies are relatively immune from some of the same considerations that animated the law here. So I don't think they're in direct danger, for example, of being regulated the same way.
Brendan Carr going to be taking the job you once had very soon. What are your expectations, if you have any, in terms of this FCC and how it will differ from that under the Biden administration?
Well, I think Brendan Carr is going to be a superb chairman. I worked very closely with him for many years, and I know that he has both deep expertise in all of the issues, as well as a determination to work hard to advance the ball in terms of American innovation and investment. And so I would expect him to clear out a lot of the regulatory underbrush that has accumulated over the last 4 years. For example, on wireless spectrum, there's been no major spectrum auction. There's not even spectrum auction authority for the FCC right now, which is incredible when you think about wireless innovation being a leader of economic growth in this country.